core person and core location. And so we've analyzed all of the comments, etc., which were made, and our experts today will suggest how to tackle them. My colleague Pavlina will provide a little bit of context of the whole revision process. I know that there are a lot of familiar faces in the chat, but I think there are also a couple of people who have tuned in today who haven't participated in the previous meeting. So Pavlina will just summarize briefly the context. And then, of course, point 3 is really it's going through the proposals for the changes, and then towards the end we'll have some actions or future actions and an overview of what is to come, as this is very much an ongoing effort which will pan out over the weeks and the 2 or 3 months to come. So just from a practical point of view, of course, the whole objective is also to give you the floor to hear your comments and questions. But please keep yourselves muted during the webinar. So if you have questions, please use the chat, and Max, myself, Pavlina will give you then the floor at the appropriate moment for the discussion. Also, do note that this webinar is recorded for documentation purposes. Very often people ask us for recordings because everyone is swamped in virtual meetings and not everyone can attend. And so if no one objects to this, we will start the recording of this webinar. Okay, without any further ado, a lot of thanks to Pavlina, who has very deeply prepared this webinar together with our team. So thank you for that, Pavlina, and happy to give the floor to you.
Thank you, Seta, for the very kind introduction. I would like to welcome you all to this webinar. As you may recall, since the beginning of the year, we started revising core vocabularies, and since it has been a long time since the latest revision. Next slide, please. We had before summer 2 webinars and we started with core person and core business. However, today we will tackle core business and core location. This is this slight changes is due to the fact that we see that a number of closely related issues about the core person and the core organization has put in the chat, so that from a content point of view, we thought that it would be better to tackle during this webinar core person and tackle core business and core public organization into our forthcoming webinar. Next slide, please. So I think that you all are well familiarized with the definitions or of our core vocabularies for what a person is, what the person represents, name, date of and place of death and birth, as well as core location, which is which Genius expressed strong interest about the different ways of describing a location, meaning VN and address, and geographic name or geometry in alignment also with the INSPIRE regulation. Next slide, please. So, as you may, as I already mentioned, there has been a lot of time since core vocabularies were revised. It was published in 2013. Core organization was published in 2016, along with the core public service. So, with the rationale behind this effort and those webinars is to go into a major release, meaning version 2. And during this release and the objective of the webinars is to introduce new to tackle the issues and to exploit your contribution and to discuss with you what you think that they should be put into this new major release. Next slide, please. So the whole revision process consists of 3 webinars. The current one, the one that we said that we are going to tackle core person and core location. We are proposing an iteration process. So we are proposing to have a second webinar the 9th of November and to provide and to have a final an ongoing review for core person and core location. We want to tackle core business and core organization during our second webinar and have a final review and on the 2nd of December. The aim is to reach to a consensus by the end of September and provide the final, the official publication of core of all core vocabularies early next year. With the different serialization. We saw that we have a number of issues on GitHub and some changes were proposed by you. So next slide, please. We took under consideration while reading your issues and while processing it, we came back to the original definition of core vocabularies, which when they were created, the objective was to be to create simplified, reusable, and extensible data models that can capture the fundamental characteristics of a data entity in a context-neutral and syntax-neutral fashion. Next slide, please. Having this in mind, during the processing, the rationale is to keep things simple and not to create conflicts with complex use cases because we saw that during the GitHub issues some complex use cases were mentioned. So we think that for a future work we would like to see whether we can create extension of core vocabularies based on some agreed complex use cases. That's why we encourage you to put your use cases into GitHub in order to see whether there is an intersection on this and consider this intersection into future work. Now I pass the floor to my colleague Dimi in order to present you the changes that we are proposing to tackle in order to be included into the major this major release.
Thank you, Pavlina and Seth, for the introduction. In a minute, I'll go over all the changes that we are proposing to the core vocabularies, but I'll also give a minute to Max to present himself as the moderator of the webinar.
Thank you, Dimi. Well, I'm Max Dekkers. I'm a member of the team that works for the SEMIC project. And today I'm, as usual in the webinars, I'm doing the moderation. I'm keeping time also, so you might hear me intervene at points to intervene in the discussion if we're running out of time. We have quite a lot of material today. We have until 12 o'clock. So we think that we have ample time also to take into account your comments and discussions. So please, if you have anything to say, please raise your hand. You can see that on the bottom of your screen there is this way of raising your hand, and then I'll keep track of the chat, and then whenever needed I'll just chip in and ask Dimi to react to questions on the chat. So Dimi, go ahead and work through the issues.
Yes, thank you, Max. First, we have two issues that are more on a general level that are applicable to all core vocabularies, not to one specifically. And the first one is on how we represent the vocabulary both in UML as well as in HTML specifications. As you know, compared to the last version of the core vocabularies, we are now using an updated template, which is fully HTML based, of which we already presented the first draft during the first series of webinars. Someone made a very valuable comment in GitHub that there are some improvements possible to this new specification. I think, for example, she was mentioning to add the different prefixes that were used to put the classes in a more logical order and not just alphabetically. And such as these, also a number of other useful improvements that will improve the usability and also the user-friendliness of the specifications. I think these are all very valuable suggestions, and we will take these into account when we create the new specification in the coming months. I'm not sure if the person responsible for the issue is here today, but I'd like to thank her for different suggestions that were made. Similarly, there was also an issue made regarding the definitions and the terminology or the labels that were used in the core vocabularies. Also very exhaustively explained by the same person. So again, thank you also very much for this work that you have prepared. Based on this, what we have done is two things. We have created a draft document that you can find also on GitHub, where we have listed the different syntax rules that we are now using to write definitions for the core vocabularies. This is a set of rules based on existing standards, ISO, for example. They're all mentioned also in the document, on which feedback is definitely still more than welcome. I think the rules will be presented in the next slide, that we will now use for creating future definitions. On the other hand, we'll also review the existing definitions compared to these rules and adapt them where needed. I should mention a small note. We will apply these rules to the maximum extent possible. What we do not want to do is that we want to change the meaning or the semantics of existing definitions. So we will try to apply the rules, but in the meanwhile, we make sure that we do not change semantics, and so that we still have semantic interoperability. But it might mean that we cannot fully apply all rules to existing definitions. So there's a bit of a balance there, activity that we need to do. But again, also the updated definitions will be shared via spreadsheet on GitHub, so you're more than welcome to give feedback on those definitions as well. These are the rules. I'll briefly explain them. They are explained in more detail in the document on GitHub. The first one is be concise but complete. To give an example, we have their definition, which can be, which might be a bit too broad. We also explain, for example, in the second sentence, for example, it's mentioned here, level 1 refers to the uppermost administrative chief for almost always a country. So this more extra information can, for example, be added to a usage note and doesn't always have to be in the definition. So we want to keep the definitions as short and concise as possible, while also being general, as the core vocabularies are context neutral. So, for example, member state can be replaced by a more general concept. The second rule is that we describe only one concept. So the definition should not explain two different concepts at once. Then there are a number of basic rules, such as using singular for the labels and also for the definitions. Rule 4 mentions that you should state what a concept is, not what it is not. That's rule 4. Rule 5 says to only use known abbreviations that are really generally known by the public. Rule 6 is to allow for similarity. So concepts that are closely related should have similar definitions. Rule 7 mentions to use graphics when needed to better explain a certain concept. Rule 8 is regarding the reuse of definitions. So when we are reusing certain concepts from international standards, we try to take over the definition to the maximum extent. As for example, when we reuse something from W3C. Rule 9 is also quite an important one, that you do not use circular definitions, so that you use the concept itself to explain the concept. As for example, the definition for person is an individual person, which is of course a bit circular. So it's better to use some different phrasing, such as a human being, and so on. And then next is also already mentioned, Rule 10. If you have secondary or extra information that's not necessarily part of the definition, it should be separate from the definition and, for example, put in a usage note, as we already have a number of those in the specification. All right. Just quickly checking the chat whether something was already mentioned.
I see the chat that people are happy to see that the terminology will be strengthened and further positive replies. If there is any more comments, then people may speak up. Eugenio gives us a link to a document that they're using for e-procurement. So I think that's also useful to have a look. So if there are any further comments, as Dimi said, the document is available on GitHub. You just have the link in the chat here, and you're welcome to give comments and further suggestions, and we can take that into account. If you have anything to say, you're welcome to say that in the chat or to raise your hand if you actually want to talk to the group. If not, then I think, Dimi, we can continue with the detailed changes.
Okay, thanks, Max. So those were the general changes that were applicable to all different core vocabularies. Right now, we would like to deep dive indeed into the changes proposed for core person specifically. This is the second version of core person, as it was prepared during the previous series of webinars. Just a small note is that already some propositions were agreed during last webinar. These are not yet reflected into this diagram. Just so you know, that already some changes are agreed upon. We will come to those at the end of the list of issues. We'll also briefly go through the different propositions that were already agreed upon. The first issue is quite a big one, where there was an issue related to conflating the different core vocabularies, core person, core public organization, and core business, into one holistic core agent vocabulary. This issue was triggered because there was mentioned that there were a few overlaps between these different vocabularies, and because they're all inheriting from both agents, whether it would make sense indeed to combine it into one. There were also some counter arguments made. It's quite a long GitHub issue as it has become. We wouldn't go through all the different arguments that were made, but I think an important aspect to note is that an agent on the one hand goes broader than just persons and organizations. As you know, FOV agent also says software, robots, and so on are also seen as agents, and that the different core vocabularies were split because they also serve their specific use cases. Use cases for core person might be different than those for core public organization. Nevertheless, we acknowledge the fact that it makes sense to show how the different core vocabularies are interlinked. This is why we also want to create an overview diagram of how the different core vocabularies fit within each other, and also to show the shared properties and shared relationships, and also to make it a bit more clear within the specific core vocabularies by adding some placeholders. So you see again that you don't necessarily have to go check the overview diagram, but you can also see it in the diagram of the specific core vocabularies, how they are related to the other core vocabularies, but then a bit more concise, not with all detailed classes and diagrams. So it's not a core agent vocabulary as such that we're proposing. We're proposing to show an overview diagram of the different core vocabularies and also how these are interlinked. So very briefly before I allow for you can discuss this. As you know, core person is inheriting from FOF person. Similarly for legal entity class and core business, it's inheriting org. The W3C's organization ontology from organization. Similarly for core public organization, which is inheriting also from the same organization, which W3C is saying is a subclass of FOF organizations. So as such, they are all inheriting from FOF agents. So there is already a certain relationship among the different core vocabularies, but currently it's not really reflective or really shown into the models. It's more in the back end, you could say, and not much visible in the front end. So we're more than happy to prepare this consolidated overview diagram that really shows how the different classes interlink between each other.
A question from Kuldar, whether the core person also includes a live event concept?
No, but it's a very good point, and there is indeed also an issue coming up on events quite related to this one. I think we propose to tackle them when the issues comes up in a minute.
And Georgia has a comment that the org organization is not a subclass of FOF organization, but an equivalent class. So it sits to the side of it rather than under it.
Okay.
Okay, we'll change that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. Related to that issue, there was also a proposition made to add contact details on that higher level, on the higher level of the agent. But as just mentioned, agents can also be, for example, software programs according to FOF. So contact details are not always relevant for each type of agent. Similarly, the contact details that you will use will be also dependent on the specific class. It doesn't, for example, some contact details will not make sense for an organization, it will make sense for a person. If you, for example, look at very specific things, it might not make sense to have a very detailed contact information element for a person that probably will not be applicable to an organization. So that's why we're actually proposing to introduce the contact info class, definitely, but really within the different specific core vocabularies, not on the higher level, but really on the specific core person, core organization level, so that we can really also add some properties that make sense for that context. Already jumping a few issues ahead probably, but as you know, currently contact point is used within the core vocabularies from schema.org. Last webinars, it was decided that we would decrease our dependence on schema.org. So we will mint our own class within the core vocabularies. We've now called it contact info. More than happy to get our feedback on that label or that name. And also some generic properties. We have listed the basic ones. You're also more than invited to add, to mention additional ones if you see those fit for the core vocabularies.
There's a comment from Georgia that she doesn't understand what a contact form for a person is. And I think this is actually what maybe something that we wrote here. I think indeed the contact form for an organization would make sense. For a person, it wouldn't make that much sense. So in that sense, what Dimi said, yes, there are different properties that are relevant for the different classes. And therefore we added as a relationship to the various classes person with different ones. So I think the diagram here, Dimi, is not correct.
Yes, correct. You see also a very good argument from Sebastian. I think one also that we discussed with the team, whether it would make sense to prepare like a code list of different contact options.
Channels. Yeah.
Channels, indeed. And then have them as a value in the second the second property where you specify indeed the exact value of the channel. I think that's a modeling decision that we have to make. I think both are valuable options or valid options. It's more of a modeling decision. The main benefit of a code list is that it has easier to change. Echt, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to react to it because if then all property, or then not all properties a channel property, so that actually you have for the contact info one class contact me through this channel, and then everything is in the channel and nothing else. So is that not the same, or is there some other additional properties that we add to the contact info that make it specific, that gives it some kind of an entity identity?
I think that's a modeling decision. I think what we have currently is sort of the simple approach. For example, also in DCAT, for example, there is a direct link from the data set to contact info, not through channels. So I think the way that we do it here is, I think, the simplest way of doing it. There might be other ways of doing it, and I think we're happy to discuss that in the future. But currently, this is the simple approach that we're proposing.
Yeah, I just want to add that in the terms of vocabulary sense, we can add new properties which act in the same way as the channel. So in that sense, it's equivalent to it. So there's not limiting, but it's more a direct approach. So this is, so if you go for the channel, then you get only one property with a code list and a value that you have to align. Here we could say we have an undetermined list of properties, of which we pick some of them, give a concrete meaning already as a list. So that's modeling, as Max said.
There are some questions I see here, if I can follow it. There is one point from Sjaak asking whether it should be known who can share with whom you want to share your contact info. And I think that's out of scope for the core vocabulary. I think that's a way that you need to determine when you're actually implementing this. There might be applications where you want to include that security, and we don't have that in the core vocabulary. The other point was from Jim, why we don't use the existing one like vcard kind. And I think what we have seen is that we like to remove a little bit the dependency on other vocabularies, although vcard kind would be a way to actually implement it. Is that what you would see, Dimi?
Yes, indeed. Need to look into detail whether vcard really supports all our use cases. But if that's a valuable option, I think that's indeed, again, a modeling decision that we need to agree on with the working group.
And it's always the question, is vcard the only one that we want to use? Are there applications that might want to use other standards for contact information? And therefore we have now, let's say, our own class that can be implemented in different ways. And a question from Kostas about the distinction between Word, email. Those are the kinds of things that you can actually add if you want that in more complex cases. This is just an example of things that you could put in there, and email and telephone are things that are widely shared. If you, for example, look at implementing it through vcard, vcard has the way of classifying the contact information as work or home and things like that. So that is possible to do that, but we don't include all those possibilities at this point in the core vocabulary. Okay. So I see, is there currently a general agreement on this proposition? So we do it this way. We pick up some of the comments made here, especially by Georgia and Jim. And we can take that into account in our further work. I see some +1s. I don't see further strong objections. So I suggest we move on, Dee.
Okay. Yes, these are two issues that are quite related. On the one hand, we have the current code list for the gender property that was set to be a bit too limited, and there were certain options not in there yet. And also on the same hand, it was mentioned that the concept gender was also used to specify human sex, while sex and gender are two different concepts. So it's two issues quite closely related to each other. And as I could mention, I can say already that a special working group has been created within the corporate reference data management coordination group to exactly investigate this issue. So they're looking at indeed harmonizing these concepts across the EU and also how to introduce new concepts in a uniform way. We've reached out to them and they've mentioned that they will reach a conclusion by the end of the year. And we will follow their recommendation. So if they say indeed we need two properties, both for sex and for gender, we will follow their conclusion. And also we'll look into the code list they are proposing for those two properties. So proposition here is simply, as they are the experts and really looking into this domain into detail, we just will propose to follow their recommendation and adopt it within the core vocabularies.
Allow me to interrupt here. We are in close contact with the publications officer, meaning that the decision that will be made by this team will be also communicated to the publication office, and then we will be on a line with the code list that will be created by the publication office.
Thank you, Marina.
Went from Sebastian asking about whether we're using schema.org for that, and I think we're coming back to that later, Dimi, about the removal of our dependency on schema.org.
Yeah, indeed.
We'll come back later. Go ahead.
Then there was an issue made regarding the use of birth date, sorry, XSD date for birth date, as it is currently insufficient for some use cases because, as rightfully mentioned, incomplete birthdays also do exist. So when partial information, also partial information is known, for example, the day might not be known, the month might not be known, or the entire birth date might not be known. As you know, yeah, currently our range of the birth date property is XSD date, which does not allow for partial dates. So our recommendation here is to use eDTF, which is also now adopted within ISO, an extension of ISO 8601 for unknown or partially known dates. So in case you want to support more complex cases, more complex dates, we propose or we recommend to use eDTF. But note that validation possibilities will decrease because if you are publishing eDTF and other persons have implemented XSD date, validation will be difficult or not simply not possible. So if possible, use XSD date. If you have more complex cases, we recommend the use of eDTF.
Any comments there? Sebastian agrees. Majority is in agreement. Any objections? If you have them, please note them in the chat. If not,
indeed, Sebastian, I think it's date that is the proper range was agreed upon last time, if I'm not mistaken. That we would change it from date time to date.
Okay, so no objections further. So move on, please.
Yep. Okay. Then there was an issue regarding the core change vocabulary. As you might know, it was kept as a placeholder in the first version of the core vocabularies, where we had the change class, not detailed and not properly worked out, but just mentioned as a potential future avenue of work. Change can be many things. Change is always as a concept is a result of events. It can be, for example, personal events. Think about indeed life events such as birth, death, marriage, and so on. And the change will then, for example, mean a change in your name or in your last name, for example. Also, same for organizational events, where you have the foundation of companies, also the fusion of companies, also having inflicting a change on other properties. These changes, often modeled as events, are often included in semantic models, but history is a different concept. It's quite important to note the difference between the two. And history is often left out of scope, as it is more implementation specific on how you will tackle that, and also because it often collides with semantics. For example, you can have multiple addresses as a person, but you can also have old addresses that are no longer relevant. So there you have a bit of a conflict between history and semantics. Nevertheless, we do agree that the vocabulary that unambiguously defines the terminology concerning history would be quite useful, e.g., for example, for implementations. So there are two aspects regarding to change it. On one hand, we really have to change such as personal events and organizational events, and also you have history regarding how to record or capture also old versions of data within a data model. We propose that this is future work because we currently do not really have a good view on all the different use cases for this potential vocabulary. So we invite you all to provide us with your use cases so that we can take this along as a future work stream to be discussed in new working groups and new webinars. Final note, I also would like to refer to the linked data event streams, of which I think a pilot list that is currently being developed, which is more a technical solution that might be worthwhile to look into if you're interested in maintaining versioning within your linked data.
Question from Jim that we have a core public event vocabulary, but the question, do we have a core event vocabulary with change included?
I think that's indeed the question we're asking. Should we have like a more broad vocabulary, more generic vocabulary called core event, which could be something different than indeed core change. So indeed, this is exactly the thing we're looking into, but we need the use cases to properly understand what we want to achieve with those vocabularies.
May I comment here a little bit? It's Kuldar from Estonia. So as I worked in projects related to life events and also business events, and I'm an academic dealing with ontologies also myself. And I actually think that events can and should be ontologically defined. So it's not about technical implementations, but it's about actually the ontological definitions, and then this should be done. I can help if needed. And why this is important is because we talk more and more about public services based on life events these days. So, and that's why I think it's rather urgent to define it ontologically also within the core vocabulary. So this is my point here.
Yeah, and I think Kuldar is very, very useful, and we really want to understand better what the situations are and what the requirements are. So please contribute to GitHub with your use cases so that we can actually find out what the best way is of doing that, and your experience there would be very helpful, I think.
Okay. Thank you.
Seth also says that it's also needed in the light of the single digital gateway and the e-wallet. So
Yeah,
we're certainly going to back that.
Yeah, Kulda, you're absolutely right. So there's a lot of kind of large scale infrastructure and semantic projects planned or in the pipeline. But we need to, how to say, this is not something that we can implement quickly. So we need to carefully think about what is the best elegant way to do this. What type of existing work will we reuse? Because of course there's already a lot of existing work out there. But so we'll definitely take this point onto our list for like the upcoming months and years. And we should kind of start up a strand or a discussion strand on this. So thank you for raising this.
To complement to this, there was an effort that started approximately 2 or 3 years ago in order to create the Core Public Event Vocabulary for some reasons that I don't know. We didn't have reached to an official release. The official release was left pending. So if there is an interest there, please contribute to GitHub on this issue, because the approach that was created some years ago, perhaps it's maybe outdated, and we would highly appreciate for your contribution on recent use cases and recent modeling that may have value for this. We will welcome you to contribute into GitHub on this. Thank you.
You're on mute, Max, I think.
Yeah. So Anna also already started the discussion. I think that's a very useful discussion to have on GitHub. And Georgia points to plenty of literature, and also if she can contribute those links, then we can take them into account. Gaia X is working on that, and I think we see already that there's quite appetite to discuss this issue. So please go ahead and contribute to GitHub on this issue, and then we'll take care of that in the part of the future work on the core vocabularies and try to solve this issue in a way that is most interoperable and also harmonized across the core vocabularies. Okay, so let's move that to the GitHub then, and then Dini, just to continue.
Yeah. Yes, this issue was already briefly mentioned a few slides ago. So as agreed last time, we would like to remove our dependence on schema.org and basically mint our own URIs for the properties that we are reusing. For core person, it's only 3 properties. It's the gender property, the birth date, and the death date. We'll do the same exercise for the other vocabularies as well. So there we would simply propose that we mint our own URIs in the Metronomic namespace, and just perhaps also with the same exercise improving the definitions. We'll also look into those definitions that we are currently using and see whether they also need to be changed. And then we simply will have our own URIs within the Metronomic namespace.
Anna makes the point that we need to have solid argumentation for no reuse of, and I think, Dimi, you can say something about that based on the discussion that we had in the group last time.
Yes, indeed. To dig back into my memory exactly what the arguments were. I know one of them was it is not really a very open working group schema.org. It's basically Google that decides, if I remember correctly, which was not really something most people favored. Also, there is an issue outstanding related to the contact point class within, or more specifically opening hours class, which was an issue we raised with schema.org, I think 3 or 4 years ago already, which was never really addressed, never answered. So it's very difficult to be both in line or to both reuse schema.org if they don't really take our suggestions or feedback into account. I think those were two main arguments why we did want to remove our reuse of schema.org.
There's a question from Sebastian, what gender code listing you rise to use? And that is part of the discussion that takes place in this working group that looks at sex and gender. They're not just looking at how many properties you would need to express that, but also which code lists would be relevant for core vocabulary. So that is something that we'll have to wait rather than trying to do something ourselves and then not listening to the experts. We decided to listen to the experts and then adopt whatever they come up with. Can I please ask people who are now discussing the change and events in the chat to please do that on GitHub, because then we have actually the discussion in the right place. We certainly will take into account what you're writing here, so it's not going to be lost. But I would really invite you to have that discussion on GitHub so that it's transparent and also well archived. Thank you.
Maybe a final note. Yeah, sorry, Max. Maybe a final note. I think regarding indeed the interoperability of schema.org, I think we also would propose to have at least a formal mapping of some kind to schema.org where possible, perhaps also contained within the distributions as equivalent properties. So we have our own URIs, but still a mapping is available to schema.org. Just as a final note on this issue. The next one is regarding two classes or two concepts that are used within the core vocabularies, for which there was a bit of confusion on how they should be used. It was the jurisdiction class and also the administrative unit concept, I would say. It was really mentioned as a class in one of the vocabularies. We proposed two definitions for those concepts to make clear what they are should represent. So the jurisdiction is more the abstract class, which is the limits or the territory within which authority may be exercised. So a bit more on a higher level. And the administrative unit is then one way in which a jurisdiction can be expressed. So the administrative unit is a unit of administration where a member state has and or exercises jurisdictional rights for local, regional, and national governance. So what we exactly propose for core person is to use this definition for jurisdiction class within core person, and then to suggest the use of the administrative unit code list, of which ATU and LAU exist, was maintained by the Publications Office, for the values of those two properties. So that means you have a generic jurisdiction class that can be reused, context neutral, and also a recommendation on EU level regarding the exact values to be provided for those two properties.
Any comments on that proposal of jurisdiction and administrative units? Any objections? See Bart agreeing, Bart Constance agrees. I don't see, I see Thomas, see all +1s. I don't see any objections. So I'm going to conclude that this proposal has been agreed, unless there is someone who comes up with a strong objection. Then we're good to move on.
All right. Yes, this issue was also related to partially known information or unknown information in order to express in a certain way that a given name or a family name does not exist for a person. As you know, currently the core vocabularies do not enforce cardinalities, so it's core vocabulary. It's not an application profile with cardinalities and restrictions on that. And it's really up to the implementation to mention whether or not a given name or a family name is required. We also believe that handling partial or non-existing information is quite application specific and out of scope of a core vocabulary. So for the core vocabulary, we do indeed propose that we do not change anything. I see already indeed a correct point from Sebastian that EIDAS does enforce this. That's correct, but EIDAS is an application profile, you could say so, application of the core vocabulary. It's a bit out of our hands, so to say.
I see agreement not to enforce, and I think your explanation that EIDAS is an application profile of core person is correct. And it's a good example of where an application profile adds cardinality constraints. Okay, I don't see any objections to not enforcing cardinalities on the core vocabulary level. So I think we're good to move on to the next.
Yes. This issue was also introduced, and it's mentioning a few more complex use cases, I could say, than is currently supported by the core vocabulary. The person was proposing the introduction of a name class. Also, for example, to keep track of historical changes in that name. So you could have multiple, for example, if your given name changes, that you would have multiple instances of that name class, one with your old given name and one with your new given name. Also here, you would for now argue that modeling historical data for persons, such as changes in name and so on, is currently out of scope, and is perhaps something that we could indeed take up within the core event or core change vocabulary that we were just discussing. So also here, we would very much like to hear your use cases so that we can agree on a set of use cases to start to work on a core change or core event vocabulary.
And there's a comment from Georgia here that there is a design pattern, and I think when we discussed it in future work and in the use cases, I think that would be a valuable pattern to consider in trying to define the way of doing that. And I do understand that in some applications it is very necessary to be able to track those changes and those historical data. And currently we really don't have enough information to do the modeling right. So we want to do that in the next phase based on people's use cases.
Okay.
And Sebastian makes that point that we also, rather than just only looking at sort of the complex cases, we also need to have sort of simple ways of doing things for very common changes that appear. We'll take that into account as well.
All right. Okay. There was a suggestion made last webinar to add the metronymic name property. As you know, metronymic name, so name based on the given name of the person's father, is currently already within person class. There was a suggestion to also include the metronymic name. It's as such, it's a simple addition to the core person vocabulary, but the question is there really a use case within the EU for which it makes sense to add this property? Because if you want to introduce the metronymic property, it also would make sense to have other variants in there as well. Just to give one is technonymic, where you have, if I'm not mistaken, your name based on your given name of your child, I think. So yeah, and you have also other variants. So you could argue that you could then have to introduce quite a number of mnemics within the core vocabulary. So yeah, an open question indeed to the different representatives of the member states, whether there really is a use case for adding metronymic name within the core vocabulary.
Any comments there? Any suggestions? Immediate use cases where we have metronymics in Europe? Well, Sebastian, that's a good point for the sake of gender equality, but It's also, we don't want to add things that are not going to be used. So that's therefore our question is this something that is being used in Europe? If so, then yeah, there's really no problem to add it. But if it's not used anywhere, then why would we want to add it? So Ethan says, so does it exist? You mean in Finland you have names that where people have also include the given name of the mother in the name? Okay, so if that is the case, then I think we might, for as Sebastian said, for gender equality, may want to add that. Well, yeah, Miguel, I know, but in Spain, it's the apellido, it's the family name that is part of the name. Yeah, so it's a surname. So we're not talking about the surname. We're talking about the way that you have in your first name. You also have an element that is based on the given name of your father or your mother. So that's a different case. So, but if the case is that there are countries in Europe where people have metronymic, then we could add that if that's okay with everybody. Yeah. So let's take that away.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah. Then there was a use case. Sorry. Good. I think there was a use case to add the parent of a person within the core vocabulary. I think the use case, if I'm not mistaken, is the birth certificate, where you have often mentioned indeed who the parent is of a person. And to add this relationship to the core vocabulary. So as a definition, we would have person who is the father or mother of the person. So really a basic generic property on the level of person is a proposition. Yes, indeed. I think the definition is indeed a very tricky one because you can have both biological and adoptive parents. And I don't think that we want to make that distinction within the core vocabulary. I think we want to keep it as generic as possible, so to allow both for the adoptive use case as well as for the biological use case, which is why we haven't added this to the definition. We haven't specified which either this. It can still be your adoptive father or your adoptive mother or your biological father or your biological mother.
Okay, let's just, can I stop here? Because there is quite a lot of discussion about patronymic and metronymic, and there's quite a lot of confusion. Because some people talk about the given name of fathers and mothers, but other people talk about the family name of fathers and mothers. And I see here that in Sweden, it was already said, it's the surname, it's not the first name. And I'm not quite sure if we now have a use case. I have a point from Georgia to say that that she doesn't see the point of introducing it in the core vocabularies. So I say the idea, what I thought was that we were agreeing that because in Finland and Sweden there is the metronymic, like Anna's daughter was the example was given here. If that's the case, then we add it. But if there is no country that has a metronymic based on the first name of the mother rather than on the surname of the mother, I think we should not. So maybe we should take that issue to GitHub, and if people want it, I want to see in issue number 25 a case where it's really the case. That's one thing. So I wanted to make that sure. So we're holding up the discussion, the decision there, unless there is someone who puts a real example in issue 25, we're not going to add it. So if we want to do that that way, if people are agreeing with that. So Ethan, if you have a real use case, please describe it so that we understand that we need the metronymic for those cases, and then we'll take it from there. Yeah, and Rita says we have comments from Iceland too. So if people know, and I don't need someone from Iceland to come forward and do that. If Rita, you know about what happens in Iceland, then please put it in issue 25 so that we can take the decision. Okay, so sorry to go back to the parents now, Dini.
No worries.
Anna said, sorry. There's two comments that father or mother is not is last century legislation, but I think people do have mothers and fathers, don't they? We're not saying we're not having properties mother and father. We have a property parent, which could be either father or mother, and people can have two fathers or two mothers or whatever. But the core vocabulary now, as the proposal here, to have a way of linking persons together with a parent relationship. So I see also we enter in the family field, and Sebastian says it might be the father or the mother. I don't think we want to go there. I think if there is no in an application, no way of identifying who the parent is, then you don't use it. But if you want to have the possibility to link a person to their ancestors, this is the way that you can do it. Okay. Yeah, so Miguel says that some ID cards keep that information. I'm not quite sure what Cecile means by the person of reference.
Can I talk just to explain what I mean? Because I think that, for instance, in depending on the legal framework, sometimes it's the father who is taken as the take the how do you say allocation familiale, the subsidies, family subsidies. Usually it's allocated to the mother. So you take the role of mother and then you are allocated this. So if you only have the information that it's the parent, it might or you should, and I don't know, because precisely because we have this so the gender problem, etc., whether who would be the person of reference in case you have more than one parent would help in defining who would be in charge of a given aspect of a child, you see?
Yeah, I see, but we're talking about the core vocabulary here. You're talking about a particular application of the core vocabulary. Because I think in the current situation, we cannot assume that everybody has one father and one mother. It might be difficult to identify this in the core vocabulary. There might be other ways of doing this. If you have a parent that is that has certain characteristics in your application, then you could do that. But we're just trying to identify a way that a person is related to their parents. And we're not talking legal parenthood, Anna. We're talking about the way that you create a link between persons. What that relationship means in legal terms or in applications is for the application or the legal text to determine. This is just a way of being able to express the relationship between persons.
Max, can I add a comment here? Giorgia Lodi, hi. Yes, that's my point. I mean, I think with this issue, we are entering into something that, at least in my country, has a specific legislation that has everything regarding family and, well, there are different relationships and so on. in a core vocabulary of a person, I would simply say that a person has some kind of relationship with another person, okay? It can be even a relationship like a person knows another one, okay? So a friendship relationship. I'm not saying which kind of relationship, but then the relationship can be specialized, as you are saying, according to the different applications.
Yes.
Going into the detail of that relationship in the family legal framework and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Although you're suggesting to have something that's even more general, any relationship, and that can be specialized. In this case, I think the proposal or the question was that we received from the working group that there would be a need to create a parent relationship. Now, if that's not the case, if people think that a parent relationship is not the right way to do it, then I think then we take that proposal back and saying we're not doing that. And then it leaves it up to applications to create their own relationships based on, I don't know, DCT relation with sub relationships. So our proposal here is based on a request from the group. If the group says this is not good enough, then we withdraw the proposal. Yeah, so I think what we see in the discussion, this is much more complicated than just adding a parent relationship. So my proposal would be, Dimi, Pavlina, that we withdraw the proposal. Yeah.
So I see also some support for that in the chat. Indeed.
Yeah, for a more general relationship.
Yeah.
So we'll put that as an issue also maybe for further work. But the current proposal to have parent, we'll take that back. Okay.
All right. Then there was an issue on the character set to be used. Our proposition there is to recommend the use of ETF8, and that even further synthetical standardization should be as out of scope for the core vocabularies, as it again will be quite application specific or context specific. Just want to note that in some properties we propose to use the language string data type, and note that there you can use both, can specify both the language used as well as the script that was used. As an example is here given for Greek in both the Greek script as well as in Latin script.
Okay. I see people agreeing with UTF-8. So no objections to that. Okay. Very many +1, so I think we can close this one and move forward to the next.
Okay. Yes, this is the one that we, someone already mentioned in the chat indeed, the live events related to a person that might be quite relevant. Also already mentioned, I think within CPS VIP, so core public service vocabulary, already 2 live events are specified, if I'm not mistaken, but then in relationship to the public service. The proposition here is again that we do not want to remove the simple case that we currently have. So the simple case of having date of birth property as well as place of birth property and country of birth properties. As is also in alignment with EIRIS. So we definitely want to still continue the support of the simple use case, but the more complex use case that can be achieved by having live event classes, such as birth or death, might of course also be quite useful. But again, there it's quite important that we have a good view on the different use cases for those classes. So again, you want to see those as a future work in the coming months or years to do. But again, we need your specific use cases for those 2 classes. So again, we invite you to put your use cases on GitHub, so we have a good view on what we want to achieve and then how to model it. We can do the new webinar.
I think Kuldar makes the point that birth and death are two examples, but there are more life events. So we need to look at life events more generally, of which then birth and date are examples. Okay, so people agree to put that in the future work category. And then we're asking people in issue 27 to come up with use cases that we can then use to start building a model for that. But not very future, full darkness. Okay. let's see when we can do that. But it's certainly something that we would ask you to further contribute to. Okay, move on.
Then there was the definition of date of birth slash death, which was reused, I think, from the schema log, if I'm not mistaken, which was a bit circular, I think, or there was another issue with it. It was not really properly formatted. So we propose here a new definition, the date on which the person was born or died, depending on the property, of course, which is also in line with the rules of ISO 11179. One could argue that indeed you use again date to specify how to define date, which is also a bit circular, but is also in line with ISO. ISO even has in that graphic specification, they also do it the same way. They also have a date that they explain.
I think when we're looking at the definitions, there are certain words that we don't have to explain, like date or place. We don't want to repeat all the dictionary definitions for those very simple things. But if there are any that in the definitions people think should be explained, then we're happy to take your comments on that. In this case, we thought that date was clear enough to keep it here in the definition. Any comments, any objections to this new definition? Ana Rosa agrees to use the way that ISO 1179 does it. We see more +1s coming in. So I think it would be useful.
Time of birth, I think. And last, I think they mean also to include the time of birth or the time of death. But I think last webinar we agreed to keep it at the level of date, keep it more generic on the level of the core vocabulary, and then people can have it more detailed in their application profiles if they prefer.
And maybe that's also an issue for the life event class. When we have a birth event, then there might be more specific or more detailed or more granular properties there. Let's keep it like that. Well, I think the discussion comes back to the discussion that we had last time, where now some people say we have to have datetime instead of date. But I think the last time the opinion was that we want to keep it at this level of granularity, that if more is needed, then there could be more properties for particular applications. Yes, so that I understand there are certain applications where the time would be relevant, but for the time being, based on a proposal that we had last time, we put the granularity at the date and not on the time. Any comments on that, Dimi, to go back to datetime?
Perhaps Bert, I remember there was an argument made to not include time, if I'm not mistaken. Do you still remember, Bert, what the exact argument was?
No, that I don't remember by heart anymore. But it is indeed the case. You have both use cases appearing, in the sense that you immediately want to have the more precise or sharing on a high level. So that means this thing. We have opened it up to have partial date with the ISO, which I think in general as well includes potentially the time.
Yes. So do we now agree to have daytime for this? Okay, so I think that lots of people agree to use daytime.
Max,
Yes.
sorry. I mean, if there are use cases with only date and other use cases where the time is important, I think we can say, at least in the RDF word, that that range is date or date time. Because when you specify daytime, you are obliged to include the time. If you don't have it, well, you can put a 000, I don't know. But in any case, I would say that we can say that the range of that property is both date and daytime, or daytime, okay? In this case, you can cover all the possible use cases that I'm seeing here. I mean, in XML or outside the RDF word is something to be understood, but in the RDF word we have these possibilities.
So from a semantic point of view, we agree that this needs to include both the date and the time. Now, how that's implemented in RDF and XML is for those implementations. But I see an agreement that we have to be able to do both. Also, Anna says that the time should be optional, but that's the case if we define it like that. Then you can provide the time if you have it, but you don't have to. Okay, so that's the proposal to have sort of date or daytime is. Yeah, but Jacques, the date and time formats include time zone indication. So that's taken care
then
of.
typically you have to add this as a recommendation to add it to be more as precise as possible, etc. Because otherwise that's the normal case.
We can do that in the usage note.
Yes,
it's recommended to use the time zone also. Good. That's
all right. Then the role or participation class related to agents. There's also an issue raised to include this within the core vocabularies. For those who know it, so currently already we have the participation class within CPS-VAP, where you have the link, where you have it as the link between an agent and a public service. So the role, the participation the agent plays with respect to that public service. For example, the provider or the requester of the public service. There was an argument made to also have this within the more within the other core vocabularies. What we propose as a bit of a recommendation is indeed that we have on the level of agent that you can say an agent plays a role, being participation, so that we include it within the overview diagram because it is already part of the core vocabulary space as part of CPSV. But we also can recommend this usage for also the other specific classes, so core person, legal entity, and public organization. But therefore, it's quite important that you have a look at the participation class and whether it really supports your use cases. And if you have other use cases that might be relevant that are not supported by the participation class, that you let us know again via GitHub to have exactly the use cases. Yeah, this is.
I think Georgia says there is a need also to have participation in what, but that's part of the description of the participation class. We haven't reproduced everything there.
No, correct. I think, yeah, within CPS-VAP, the third class, the participation is regards to a public service. I think that's too narrow a scope for what people are need for the other core vocabularies. So we haven't specified like the third class in this one. But indeed might be relevant to also have some sort of agreement to what participation is related to, but I'm not sure whether there really is a class that we can point it against, aside from like more abstract class such as RDFS resource, for example. I also agree that the role is missing. Properties are not mentioned here. I think there were 2 or 3 properties included within CPSV, which is the role, description, I think even the third one.
Okay. So let's look at that. What needs to be added here in the diagram to make it clear what the participation is about. And then we're inviting further comments on issue 31 when people have had the chance to look at the CV participation from CPSV and say if they think it meets their use cases or not.
Yep. I think membership, Peter, I think it's a bit more narrow. If I'm not mistaken, membership is in relation to an organization, while participation is not, is more broad. Can, for example, be indeed me as a requester of a public service, which does not mean that I have some sort of relationship or membership of the public organization from which I am requesting the public service.
And Georgia and Emilia are already making that argument also in the chat. So, but please, issue 31 is open for further comments if you have them. And for the time being, we're keeping this proposal open, and then we'll decide what to do if we have people's comments on that. Okay.
Okay. Then there was an argument made to add the secondary or temporary address within core person. We currently have 2 properties. We have the generic address property, so you can specify an address for a person. And as you know, we don't specify cardinality, so you can specify as many addresses for that person as you want. But we propose not to include all the different kinds of sub-properties of address within the core vocabulary. We do specify the registered address, it's one that is registered within some sort of national registry, for example, but not to also have like a secondary address subproperty, a temporary address subproperty, and so on, because you can imagine quite a few of subproperties, an infinite amount of subproperties. But yeah, of course, you're again allowed to do that within your specific application to specify a subproperty. But within the core vocabulary, we propose just to have those 2. So the generic one, address, and then the subproperty, registered address.
Okay. Don't see any comments on this one. So we'll have to have a...
Max, hi. Can I ask you a question? So you want to keep the address property as a generic one that is defined where? In person or in a core location?
Core location.
Okay, so we may add the prefix there in order to understand in which from which come from. And to only include here in person the registered address, which is a subproperty of the address, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, because here there is written subproperty in the core vocabularies. You mean we use a registered address in all the other core vocabularies, which is a subproperty of address defined in the core location? This is what you mean?
Correct.
Okay,
yes,
thanks.
Correct.
That's fine.
To clarify, there is also an issue. I think it's the next. No, it's coming up in the Person Core Location, where you see that we want to add those 2. Add registered address to core location. It's coming up.
Okay. So can address have a type? Is the question from Eugenio? We don't have that currently, I think, in the core location address. Would that be in addition? Is that something we need to discuss in the next part of the webinar when we talk about location?
This is similar. This is similar as qualifying the address for a particular use case or a particular setting. And we have different modeling approaches to this. Either you do sub-properties like we see here. This is the case where we do a sub-property with a particular meaning for registered address with respect to address. Either you go towards a more expanded notion with a role-based, like we have seen before, with participation, where you add a class in the middle with some code list aside aligned to it, etc. So this is kind of the balance to see. And for only in terms of the core vocabularies, we only see two kinds of basic terms to be seen: address as a generic one, so to denote the address relationship, and either the registered address, which is kind of officially registered in some way system. That's the meaning of it. So you can have an address for some reasons to collect everything, and then the registered address would be then officially registered in some system. And what that might be, that is then even open. So you might even have multiple registered addresses in some use cases, because depending on many official registered systems.
Okay. Okay, so see.
All right.
Yeah. Okay.
And the last issue on core person, as we already mentioned, EIDAS is reusing core person. There's also a formal mapping made. We did a check. New version of core person does not break the alignment, so the changes proposed is still in line with EIDAS. And as you might know, EIDAS is also being updated. So we're in close contact with them, and we are following the progress they're making there. And we also there's communication both ways in terms of the changes that are being proposed here and also within EIDAS. So just so you know, we are keeping this on our agenda.
Okay.
There were some other issues still listed in GitHub. Just to very quickly go over them, so we still have enough time for core location to be discussed. In the first webinar, it was already agreed to align per person with the public document schemas via the adding of alternative labels. For example, they use family names, we use surnames, so we have added those labels. There's an issue where we mentioned that we will keep both country of birth and place of birth properties, as they have a specific use case that is explained within the GitHub issue. To have an issuing authority URI and issuing authority name properties within identifier to really specify or to distinguish between the two, and to add a scheme to the identifier class related to mapped on DCT conforms to, that relates to the scheme that is used to make the identifier, or the syntax of the identifier. And then there are some more technical fixes, you could say, or more editorial fixes. Also a number of issues still open. To set the domain of the properties properly where needed, to update XML schemas, to fix a typo in Johan Bach's first name, that we will explain the use of the different data types related to text, strings, and literals, and to use them consistently throughout the core vocabularies, and also that we check that all the inconsistencies between the data types in the XSD and the HTML specification are correct or fixed. So just, normally now with this list of issues, we've tackled all the issues or mentioned all the issues that are currently open within GitHub. Are there other points? I see some questions already in the chat.
It is about the administrative unit level 3. But Sebastian already says that we can talk about that in the part on the location that we need to go into now.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So maybe we could just move over this one because we have another 30 minutes, but we also need to talk about the core location. So anything else that people want to raise for person, please raise that in the chat and we'll take care of that after the webinar, but let's go into the core location now, Dini.
Yes, all right. So core location, as you know, 3 main classes that can be related to any kind of resource. We have DCT location, the geometry class, and then the address class, where we now have 2 properties, both the address one and the registered address one, as just mentioned within the context of core person. The first issue was more an editorial issue, where it was mentioned that the releases are not really that easy, because it would be easier to have, I think, one zip file with all the different distributions, so it can be easily downloaded. Very valid comment, and we will take this into account when we publish the new distributions. We have it in a very user-friendly way to download everything in once. More of an editorial issue. Then the second issue on core location is quite an elaborated one, where they specify quite a number of use cases for vocabularies related to location, I would say, but all of these requirements have been looked into and they have been addressed in the context of Geodiga TP since its second release, as also mentioned here in the table. So normally there are no use cases anymore that are not tackled yet within that issue. So the issue is closed. Yes, this one. The range of the geometry property. How it currently is that there is a bit of a mismatch, you could say. There is a strict, there is a range mentioned within W3C's version of the vocabulary, where they say that both a literal or a URI or a geometry class can be the range of that property. Well, that's actually what they say in the examples, but within really the spec itself, they only say the geometry class. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. And in our previous version, we proposed indeed to have all these 3 different type of ranges as possible ranges for a geometry property. In our new version, we propose to have simply the geometry class, because the geometry class now combines the different possibilities. So on the one hand, you have here the GML literal, which is actually this literal that was being referred to in the previous version, as well as the WKT literal. On the other hand, you have, of course, the geometry class itself, which is still relevant, where you also have other options such as the latitude and the longitude, or the coordinates in one string, and specification of with specifying a coordinate reference system according to a URI. And also, of course, the URI is still supported using the DCT location class, where you have a geographic identifier property. So why do we propose this? It's a bit more clean, I would say. It's a bit more coherent way of modeling. But note that we make then the core vocabulary a bit more restrictive than W3C. But of course, backwards compatibility is still achieved. So that's the proposition.
I see a comment from Ana Rosa, who is not in agreement with using geometry, because some base addresses do not work with geometry by location names. Although what we have here is actually based on the W3C specification. So this is why we use the geometry here.
If I may, W3C could say whatever, but we are modeling the reality, the information we have. So if you use this, for instance, for the live events, we cannot represent the place of birth or the place of death with geometry. It's impossible for us.
Yeah, so but you wouldn't use geometry then. If you go back to the previous slide, Dini, that there are different ways of doing that. So you can actually either do a location or a geometry or an address. So you're not forced to use geometry, you use geometry.
Okay, so you are not there is no substitution between location and geometry. It's just adding a geometry.
Yeah, if you have a geometry, this is the way that you can provide it.
Okay, okay. If it's only an extra option to use, then okay, perfect.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so
we have an agreement then?
yeah, I think so. The proposal is not to only have geometry to identify places, but the proposal is to restrict the range that we're having in the core vocabulary, which is basically tidying up what the W3C specification says.
Indeed. And indeed, what Georgia says is also correct. If you have a location, you can also specify a geometry. That's definitely possible as well.
Okay, so I see +1s. So let's take that as a yes. So we're going to the next one.
Yeah. This one already discussed a few minutes ago. So indeed, we would like to include a registered address property also within core location. So it also will make sense to use this on other types of resources, not only on persons. For example, also on, I think it is even part already of core legal, core business flow and the legal entity class. So I think it makes sense to include this within the core location vocabulary. Such
Comments on that from the group? So making it consistent across the core vocabularies by adding it here as well. I don't see any objections. I see a +1 coming in, so I see more +1s coming in, so I don't see any objections. So we'll take this. Eugenia comes back to this modeling issue of having address types rather than subproperties, but I think we made the case that this is the way that we currently do the modeling, and if we want to change the modeling approach, then I think we can further discuss that.
Okay. I think then this was already mentioned in the chat that some member states need more detailed levels of administrative units than just the second level. So currently we have the first level and the second level within the address class. There was a mention of more introducing a more generic property. For example, political geocoding URI was a name that was given to it. So you can basically specify your own as many levels as you want. Proposition here is that, and again, coming back then to the objective of the core vocabularies, which is simplicity. If you need, if you have a simple case, we simply propose that you use the address class from core location, which is also, as you know, based on the address representation class from Inspire. So there's the direct link to that one. But if you need more structured representation, we refer to Inspire because there all the modeling work has already been done. Normally, it's also in line with, also there the member states are invited to participate in working groups, and also there a more structured representation of address and all its different components is already created. So what we propose here is the core vocabularies are for the simple use cases for simple addresses. So if that's your third use case, please use the core vocabulary. But if you're in need for a more structured presentations, we propose that you look into Inspire. I see a question of Inspire having a useful RDF vocabulary. I remember Bert, you sharing something that are currently, no, perfect.
And there's a question whether there is an RDF representation of Inspire, and I think that there are guidelines for that. I'm trying to put that in the chat.
I checked it already in the chat, Max. The link.
Oh, okay. And I have a guidelines as well, so we have two of those. Any objections to the proposal to have a simple way to do it in the core vocabularies and a more structured representation from Inspire.
As you can imagine, Sebastian, here I raised the ticket, and with a decentralized structure in Germany, we something beyond state and state. But yeah, if the solution is to add it everywhere in the application profiles, I think we have to live with it. But please consider with growing Europe, more interconnections and so on. This sounds a bit too short, member state and state.
Well, but if you have more need, then you could use Inspire for that. That's the proposal. And Inspire has a way of doing more levels. But then not everybody has to use that in the core vocabulary. In the core vocabulary, we keep it simple. Yeah, I see Bert. Yeah,
I just want to add to it in the sense that Inspire actually did this harmonization effort for addresses. So we essentially trying to adopt the good work, or at least the harmonization work for the addresses here. So I think the core vocabulary cannot do this work again. The strong legal setting, the discussions that has been done in that community around addresses exists, are well thought through, or at least discussed with the experts on addresses in every member state. So there should be a good basis in every member state for this structured approach. So that is the assumption. If that's not the case for your member state, then it might be that you have to discuss with the community, the Inspire community, in your to see how you can improve that. Because we cannot start doing parallel modeling in the CIMIC community just for that it's easier to model and to for some other use cases, if this already has been done. So
I have Georgia and Ana Rosa in that order. Georgia?
No, I totally agree with this. No, I didn't raise my hands. I've probably before, but anyway, I totally agree with you on this proposal. I mean, if we need something more complex, we can use Inspire, and we have the model, we have the guidelines that you said. But in some cases, also knowing data, real data, we don't need that complexity. Well, we don't have that complexity. And so it's fair enough to have the address classes in the core location.
And then I have Ana Rosa.
I have a question, because we are discussing about the political geocoding URI, but at least I'm not sure what you mean by this attribute, what you are trying to represent with this attribute, which is a political. Well, URI is clear what it is, but what is a political geocoding? What you are trying to represent here?
Yeah, it was just a suggestion for a name that was given. Basically, what the intent was of this property is to have a generic property that can allow to specify a number of political units, territorial units within the address. But to have something more generic.
Yes, that's what I thought, but I needed to check it, because I mean, Inspire is about locations, how you can represent any location in the world. But political geocoding is about government organizations. And then Sebastian is right. We already have in the European Public Office a structure and a data for this political geocoding. We have nodes and law. So this is not about address. This is not about Inspire, because we are not trying to represent specific points in the world. We are trying to represent these administrative territorial units either at NUTS level or at law level. So we cannot mix things. We are not talking about addresses. So if we were representing just points in the world, then I agree that we can use address or inspire if we need a more specific structural representation. But if we are speaking about representing the government's administrative organization, then the European Public Office already has this representation as NUTS and law, so we should follow that.
Any comments there, Dimi, Bert?
Yeah, but of course, this is about code list, but the question as well, it has to do with a component inside an address. That was as well the link. So
yes, you already have. It's not only about code list. It's also about the structure. You have NUTS 0, which is a member state. You have a NUTS 1, a NUTS 3, which is a region. You have a. I mean, you already have not only the codes but the structure of how you represent the government, the governmental unit, territorial unit. So it is not only about code list, it's also about the structure we are used to use. I mean, we already have it. Yes, it's for statistical purposes, but it really represents the geographical, and even for Spain, it's even more true what you say, Georgia, because for instance, for us, NUTS 1 is not an administrative territorial unit. It is only a statistical unit, but we don't have, I mean, we don't have more things that they are already represented there. So that is enough for Spain, even when NUTS 1 is not a political territorial unit in Spain. So in our case, we won't use NUTS 1, but we already have that structure set in the European Union.
Chris?
Just to comment, I think, I don't know it exactly by heart, but if I'm not mistaken, the code list that is recommended for the current property of administrative unit level 2 is indeed to use NUTS, ATU, or LAU, depending on your needs, if I'm not mistaken. To double check that, I think that's already the current recommendation, to use one of those three code lists from the OP.
Okay, so I understand that the proposal is still under discussion. So we move that back to issue number 12 and then see whether we can reach a conclusion there on the discussion. Is that correct?
And Max?
Yeah.
I have a general comment here related to structuring the address, which is well, I think we should not say to people to please use the full address instead of the structured components. This is what you say at the moment. Scope node of full address. And I could live with here with admin unit L1, L2, but we should not enforce to unstructured data if you have structured data.
No, we're not enforcing that. It says, I think maybe the discussion or the scope node or the usage node would maybe be a little bit more loose. It actually says that it's now said it's recommended. It is in many cases I've seen in other places in the world also, because addresses are so complex that it's useful to have one field where you have the whole address without the structures, but we can look at how we can make that a little bit less strict.
Thank you, especially with it will not suffer, but it's good to break up the component.
Yeah. We could say that if you have structured information, please provide it. But as Georgia said, that the full address is something that is usually a catch-all that covers the things that you can't say very well in structured ways. Yeah, okay, so let's move. We have another 8 minutes, so if we want to...
Yeah, I think this is the last issue. There was a discussion last time on whether address is a spatial object. It was quite a, well, semantical discussion. And the current definition issue was raised because the current definition does state that within communication, and an address is defined as a spatial object that in a human readable way identifies a fixed location of a property. If you go to look into Inspire, this definition of address, they don't really mention it as such. They don't put it in their own definition that it is or isn't a spatial object. But if you then again look into Inspire's definition of address representation class, which is actually the class that we are reusing within the core location vocabulary, there they mention it as a representation of an address spatial object. So yeah, as we're not experts in the field of addresses, we simply propose that we use their definition. So we take it over from Inspire, and so at the bottom of the slide you see our new definition being a representation of an address spatial object within a human readable way identifies a fixed location of a property. So in the first part is changed. So that's our proposal for a new definition, but we would like to note also that yeah, it's a definition, and we don't need to be too how to say, strict about it. It's important that it's correct, but it's more, yeah.
And we're reusing the definition from Inspire.
Yeah, voilà.
I see Eugenio is in agreement with that. So I don't see any objections. Well, it says so, Georgia. It says representation of address spatial object. And we don't think that we need to go into further discussion about that.
No, sorry, can you repeat this? So from your point of view, the address is not a spatial object, it's the representation of an address a spatial object?
Yeah.
That's the way Inspire puts it. Yeah.
But Inspire or the guidelines RDF for Inspire?
Georgia, we are basing the SEMIC address definition on the Inspire address representation definition. That's the alignment. There we align with.
That's why, because in the RDF guidelines, I think that they eliminated the address representation definition, saying that the address is more on the core location W3C stuff, which is a spatial object according to GeoSparkle. So
yeah,
I would suggest
here
to
there might
look
be
at
a
those
misunderstanding
guidelines.
in this indeed, but with the SEMIC core vocabulary, we focus on the simple case of the address, the simple representation. That's the address representation in corresponding in his Inspire, where we use, let's say, the common terminology for addresses. So we call it an address, but if we would be really strict in the same disambiguation as in the Inspire community, then we would say it is an address representation and not anymore an address at the core vocabulary. And then having relating this to the structured idea, the address of Inspire, and that being the address. So that is the where the confusion might come from, in the sense that the core vocabulary has adopted the common terminology for the but refers to it in its structuring to the address representation of Inspire.
But I see a number of objections to that, and I see Rob Walker proposing, I think, to delete the part that says representation of, and just say that the address is an address spatial object that in human readable way identifies a fixed location. Indirect position. I'm not quite sure what Tarja means by indirect position. So the point here is, I don't think we have an agreement here. So currently, I think for the time being, we keep the current definition, and we're taking in issue 15 further comments and further suggestions of how to do that. And then we see in the next weeks whether we can come to an agreement on that.
Yeah. We'll also look into ISO, which Rob is mentioning, and also the idea of guidelines of Inspire.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Move on.
Yeah, then there were some other issues still in GitHub that we haven't tackled in the slides today yet. Again, minor issues such as a typo in the diagram that will be fixed normally. Again, also to update the schemas in the vocabulary packages. And then, of course, there were also 3 issues highlighted that were already tackled within Person, as these were the generic issues that were tackled at the beginning of this webinar. And finally, also the administrative unit was also a need for clarification, which we already tackled. We discussed also the jurisdiction clause. Then we're through the issues that were blocked on GitHub. Were there other remarks, other feedback points related to core location?
Okay, so I don't see anybody. Well, we're actually 11:59, so we only have a minute left for our wrap up.
Yep.
And is that Paulina or Seth who are taking this?
I can take it.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Paulina, go ahead.
First of all, I would like to thank you all for your contribution. I would like to highlight 3 points that were mentioned into the discussion. First of all, you highlighted the need for a consolidated diagram. Certain points of during our discussion, it was a mixture, it was a misunderstanding about fragmented parts of the diagrams that has to do with the synergies with the rest of the vocabulary. So I would like to say that this is our intention after the discussion of the different GitHub issues to create a consolidated diagram which also have includes the interconnections with other vocabularies such as CPSV, AAP, and CCCEV in order to better highlight specific parts such as how the link is performed with the different vocabularies. The second is we identified the need of the discussion of the core event. And the third one is to address to Anne's comments whether we were going to publish updated drafts of the HTML specification before our our final publication in January. Yes, it is in our intention. That's why we would like to have your contribution to the designing data modeling and designing rules in order to provide where and if needed the final correction or revamping of the specifications and in the definitions so that we can have them before our at least a draft version before our final publication in January. So how we will proceed? We would like to invite you to provide feedback to the 2 webinar, the 2 vocabularies that we just discussed before the 23rd of November. And since we already announced that we would like to have a webinar on core business and core public organization by the 9th of November, we would like to welcome you to put your issues, contribution and issues, new issues or contribution to existing ones into GitHub by the 2nd of November so that we will have time to process them, and in order to have also a feedback after the webinar by the 13th of November, we would like to discuss all comments put by the 23rd of November into our last hopefully our last webinar that will take place the 2nd of December. So that is the plan, and then we would like to have you contributing to this. So please let's move on to the next slide. So we would like to highlight the fact that we remind you that the seminar conference will take place in the 8th of December, and would like to keep you on board. We'll have you on board. I would like to thank you very much for your present and as well as your valuable comments. That's all from my side.
Likewise, thanks a lot, Pavina, for summing everything up. Thanks again for the fruitful discussions, and looking forward to continue this in the next webinar.
Okay.
Have a good lunch.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Oui.
Bye, thank you.